Good morning, everybody. I am Paul Farmer, the COO of the Monterey County Business Council. We want to give you a warm and hearty welcome and an applause for you for coming here. I'm going to try to bring my Friday energy, not my Monday energy, which is totally different. So let's see. Oh, is there a clicker here for me? I was not instructed. I just need to go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to start off with a few thank yous of the people who made this possible. Go ahead. I should have a clicker, but I don't. Let's click. Is it this?
Yeah, it is there.
I have never seen this before. Oh, the green one's click? I tell you, they've made it easy for me. Thank yous. All of the elected officials in the room, please rise. I know there's some of you out there. I see Aurelio, Marianne. You know, Ian Oglesby is here, but I think he's working on some deals out there in the breakfast area. The MCBC staff, a lot of them are there, but if you're here, stand up and we'll say thank you to you. Mr. Richard Vaughn, the county's economic development manager, you can stand up. And anybody on the county's economic development committee, if you're on the economic development committee, Nick Kite, thank you, Heather. Most importantly, I know none of them were able to join us today, but we want to thank the County Board of Supervisors because they provided the funding for Monterey County Business Council to do the type of work that we do, including the money that paid for Beacon Economics work, which we're able to share with you all today. We're releasing this groundbreaking report today. Nobody in the county has to pay anything for it because the county, as part of their support for local businesses, paid for it through our relationship with MCBC. And to give you a quick commercial on MCBC programs because you need to know what we do, and then I have something in it for you in just a moment. So our programs, we have the Building Business Back program, which is a collaboration with the county. We were funded $3 million over 3 years as part of the American Recovery Plan Act funds the county received. They said, you know, part of this needs to help businesses recover because at that time we didn't know what the pandemic was going to mean. And so that allowed us to create this program that has a few outreach consultants who talk with businesses and say, what are your problems and how can we help? And we were also doing a few economic development studies in the county that I'll talk to you about in a moment. We have the Monterey Bay Apex Accelerator. The director, Victor Valdez, is here somewhere. There he is in the back. Apex Accelerator helps businesses that want to get into government contracting. So we have procurement counselors who will walk you through the process, help you win and retain government contracts. We bring in millions and millions. I think last year it was $16 million in economic impact to the County of Monterey. We have Leadership Monterey County, which is going into its 6th year this next year. We have a cohort of up to 30 people who spend one Friday a month for 10 months getting out and talking to leaders in our community in a variety of disciplines. We're gonna, Kendra Howell, raise your hand. Kendra is the board chair. Thank you, Kendra. And then Brad Levang. Now I have to name all the board members. Brad Levang's here too. We're going to open up applications in October for that program. Applications are due by January, and the program starts in February, runs February to November. And then the latest, greatest that we just were announced as the recipient of the contract to administer the small business development centers for Monterey and San Benito County. And Roger, please stand. So Roger is our director of that program. It provides free one-on-one business advising if you have a business in Monterey County or San Benito County or you want to start one. Also, if you're looking for capital to grow your business, to buy a building, to buy a business, things like that. So Roger's your man, and we're happy to have that be part of our programs. Today we released this flagship report, but we're also doing some other economic development support within the county. One of those is we got together the leaders, the city managers, including Paul Wood, and Carmen Gill is here, in Gonzales and Soledad, King City, and Greenfield, and talked about what they needed, what was going on down there. And they said, you know, one of the problems they have is retail leakage, where their residents have to drive to Salinas or elsewhere to buy the products they need to live their daily lives. And so what we're doing is a retail study that looks at what are the gaps in retail, what types of businesses could they support that they don't have right now. And we're using a lot of the great technology that's out there to help with that. And that report will be released in a couple of weeks. And then it helps them to figure out what businesses they can put in the empty spaces they have within their businesses. We're helping support, Hans Uslar from the City of Monterey is leading with the Monterey Bay Defense Alliance, the local defense industry's economic impact. So we made a contribution to that, and the City of Monterey is helping lead that. The City of Soledad is wants to determine the feasibility of building something they call a container village on a piece of land that they have. And so they're working with the Business Council to see, does this make sense? How do we go about funding it? How do we go about running it? Things like that. Okay, so that's my commercial on us. And then I wanted to tell you that we have some gifts for you. There is a bag on the table for each of you. Please take one. Instead of us buying, like, I don't know, a little bottle of water or something, we said this is an opportunity for us to support more local businesses. So you'll see a card in there. There's some car freshener. There's a few cool products, but it's all about supporting local businesses. The Lavender Creek Company was the Small Business Development Center Business of the Year for last year in our whole region. And so we want to support local businesses, so our thank you to you is supporting local businesses. And at the end of the presentation, we have Monterey touring vehicles. Heather's in here. So our grand prize, we're going to have 3 of them. For those who are able to stay to the end of Dr. Thornburg's presentation, we'll do something. We're going to give away 3 grand prizes where you get one of those cool classic cars for a 4-hour rental, and you get to look cool, take pictures, put it on your Instagram, all that stuff. All right, and now for the star of our show, no more Paul Farmer, Dr. Chris Thornburg. So, Dr. Christopher Thornburg has been called many things throughout his career, but his favorite thing to be called is correct. Insert applause, laughter. He founded Beacon Economics in 2006, and the firm quickly made a name for itself as the only major forecast on the West Coast to correctly predict the collapse of the subprime real estate bubble and the global recession that followed. More correct calls followed, including predicting the rapid V-shaped recovery from the pandemic and the subsequent surge in inflation. Under Dr. Thornburg's leadership, Beacon Economics has become one of the most respected research organizations in California, producing economic forecasts, impact analyses, policy studies, and regional economic analysis for private industry, public agencies, and nonprofits. With a career rooted in academia, Dr. Thornburg holds a PhD in business economics from the Anderson School at UCLA, where he later taught in the MBA program and served as a senior economist with the Anderson Forecast. As a thought leader and a dynamic public speaker, have you heard him speak before? Dynamic is appropriate. Dr. Thornburg speaks in front of tens of thousands of people every year. We're fortunate to have him today, urging audiences to ask the right economic questions before accepting pervasive social and political narratives. Let's hear it for Dr. Thornburg.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning. I got to find a good place to stand here. Good morning. Now, it is absolutely amazing to be back in Monterey. I do get up here on a regular basis to do talks for groups who are having conventions here, as the case may be, but this is my first time talking here live in person in front of an audience, for a public audience, since pre-pandemic, as the case may be. So absolutely wonderful to be back with you. Let me just dive right in, because we have a lot to talk about today. But to get there, what I need to do, of course, is start with an overview, a little bit of the company, but also a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, because there's a lot going on here, to say the very least. So many things to talk about without a lot of time. My company was formed back in 2006. That's when I left UCLA. Very simply, when I was in academia, I became inordinately frustrated with the idea that you had all these smart people talking about issues that really had very little importance to the real world, where in the real world you had a lot of conversations built around political narratives that had little standing in actual data. I started cutting my teeth in the idea of putting together what I would call academic rigor with true public policy conversations at the UCLA Forecast, and of course have carried that forward to today. Beacon, we're about 20 people strong, and as noted, we do all sorts of different kinds of studies, but in the end, what we do is we let the data tell us what the story is, rather than starting with the story and, shall we say, torturing the data until it confesses. Now, The other part, of course, what we're going to talk about today is really, well, I mean, there's two things we need to talk about from an overarching perspective. Today's presentation is going to focus first on what we think is happening in our economy, right? In other words, our lived experience, the social narratives around us today. Think about what we're hearing in terms of this contentious presidential campaign and those debates we heard the other night, or indeed the kind of stories we see in the paper on a day-to-day basis. Now, the second big thing we need to talk about is, going back to the data, what's actually happening in our economy. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is these are not the same thing. They should be. In fact, when I was doing my PhD in economics, we were taught about, at the bottom of all these wonderful models, is this person called the Homo economist, who internalizes data and with that realistic vision of the world, go out and make the best decisions they can. Now, what has happened since I started dealing with the real world is I quickly came to the conclusion that the idea of the rational agent is, shall we say, soft, at least, okay? In fact, over and over and over again, what I've seen over the last 15 to 20 years of my career is constantly seeing where the narrative is saying one thing, where the data clearly says something completely different. And that's really important, because what you have to recognize, if you really want to know what's going to be happening in our economy, you can't look at just the narrative, and you certainly can't look at just the data. You have to look at both. Why? Because in the end, it is narratives that drive decisions, the decisions of households, the decisions of businesses, the decisions of policymakers. But it is economic reality that will ultimately determine the outcome of those decisions. So if you really want to know what's going to happen in our economy, you have to look at the juncture of these two important drivers, also always recognizing that they are not necessarily the same thing. Now, with all that being said, of course, we're going to talk about this at the national level, we're going to talk about this at the local level, and at the very end of this, you're going to be scratching your head and going, wow, that was a lot of data. How do I get that? Well, at the very, very end of my presentation, we'll have a couple minutes for Q&A, and there'll be a QR code. That QR code will get you a copy of the presentation, and I believe it will also get you a link to the report that we produced for today. Now, in terms of what we're going to do in terms of this talk, the next 85 minutes or so, we're really going to start at the big level. I need to talk about the U.S. economy. I need to talk about the California economy. Now, I know we're here to hear about Monterey, but ultimately, where Monterey goes is a function of the greater economy. So we have to talk about these. And remember, a lot of the pressures you feel here in Monterey are the same pressures as California overall. So we need to segment California out and talk a little bit about that. We're obviously going to be talking about current trends in the Central Coast with a special focus, a deep dive on Monterey County itself. And we're going to be sharing a few of the highlights of the sub-regional analysis. And that's one of the keys here. One of the things you're going to be able to get is an enormous document that we put together over the last couple months, which is more or less a trends report. And what we've done is we've actually worked with the county to get what's called the confidential employment data, which allows us to track employment on a business-by-business basis within the county. It's a truly unique data set. It's very few areas are investing in this right now. And what it allows us to do is really see what each sub-economy in Monterey is what's going on in each one of these sub-economies. And so go through that data, understand wherever you live, here's good data on what's happening locally. And that, of course, gives you a great starting point to understand where the economy goes from here. And on that basis, I think the big question we have today, because remember, I'm working with, of course, development agencies. And the questions we have today, yes, we need to understand the baselines in terms of where the economy is, where it's going, but then what about the bigger conversation about economic development? And on this particular front, what I want you to really be thinking about as we go through this high-level data is ultimately understanding what's truly happening is going to end up being the key of any kind of development policies. Ultimately, the right development policies have to start with the right narratives. All right? If you don't have the right narrative, it's very hard to put the right policy into place. And so the idea of this report is to build that ground level reality, to start putting actual ground level development strategies on top of it. Other couple thoughts on that. When it comes to economic development conversations, you always want to focus on achievable goals rather than utopian visions, which is a big problem in our state. We always hear development in terms of these utopian visions. I want every kid to have a full belly and to get a graduate degree from Stanford University, and every part of our economy is going to be the next Silicon Valley. Sounds good, not realistic. Instead, you have to have a ground level understanding of what your economy is right now and understand that small changes can ultimately have big impacts, but you have to work with the actual structure of the economy and what is achievable in the next short run. And ultimately, success can only be achieved if it's measured. And again, going back to this report, what this report is really about is creating that ground level conditions. Here is where we are right now, and being able to see the success of these strategies over the next few years is going to, of course, depend on tracking this particular data as we move forward, and that is something we look forward to doing with the county and, of course, the MCBC. So, that's it in a nutshell. Let's dive right into the data. Hold up tight, because I got like 85 slides coming. We've got to get through this. So, here we go. 23, 2024. Been an interesting couple of years after, of course, another interesting couple of years. In fact, the last 5 years has certainly been topsy-turvy, and we've seen it over the last 2 years. Remember, it was about 2 years ago today when all of a sudden everybody got super pessimistic. You remember we had just come out of the pandemic and it seemed like everything was okay, but then inflation kicked in and the Fed started stomping on the brakes and interest rates went up, and all these economists started telling us how we were going to go into another recession. Now, in the beginning of 2023, it was almost fait accompli according to the press. It wasn't a function of whether or not we were going to have a recession. It was only when was it going to start. But unfortunately for all those pessimists, we got to the end of 2023, and there was no recession. And not only that was not any recession, but there turned out to be a lot of good news. Inflation started cooling off. We started hearing about the Fed pivoting and having a number of rate cuts over the course of this year. By the way, we just got one of those rate cuts just the other day. By April of this year, we were told by the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. economy is now the envy of the world. That's a big turnaround in 18 months. We're going to have a recession to envy of the world. But just a couple months later, we were told we're probably already in a recession. Now, if your head's starting to spin here, yeah, then this is a little ridiculous. And, you know, I look at these kind of headlines, and it seems to me that a lot of forecasters out there are trying to prove the old saying about economists, that an economist is an expert who will know tomorrow why the things he predicted yesterday didn't come true today, right? Now, this, by the way, this was said by a guy named Lawrence Peter. And if you're wondering about that name, yes, he's also the guy who came up with the Peter Principle. This man was a true genius of our times, to say the least. Now, we have not bought into the recession outlook at Beacon Economics. We contribute to the Wall Street Journal sort of probability of the next recession. You can see we're along there in the bottom. The average probability of a recession was above 60%, incredibly high in this data. We never got above 20%, and even that morning, I think I just hit the 2 wrong on my keyboard when I was trying to fill my survey out. But with all this being said, you know, look, we're not worried now. There's no doubt about it. We're not going to have a recession in the next 12 months or even the next couple of years. There's not going to be any October surprise before the run-up to this contentious election. And the reason for that is basically that the consumer is alive and well. I'm going to get into some of the data on this, but for all our stories about how tough the consumer has it right now, the reality is consumer spending is alive and well, and American households have some of the best financial underpinnings we've ever seen in the data. I get it. You've never seen this in the news, but in fact, when I show you the data, this is what's going on. And more importantly, we're starting to see a pickup in labor force growth, which is really good news for a nation that has been actually quite labor force constrained over the course of the last couple of years. But with all this good news, we are worried about the medium term. We're worried about the medium term for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you want to look at the economy in an honest sort of way, you would not actually say the U.S. economy is too cool or going into recession. You could actually start to argue that our economy is overheating. And we're overheating on the basis of an enormous federal deficit that continues to pump stimulus into an economy that actually doesn't need it. And of course, we also have this enormous asset bubble, which is undoubtedly going to be made worse as a result of the rate cuts that the Federal Reserve just put into place. And of course, the biggest issue of all is we're not telling the correct story about what's actually happening. The fact that our narratives are so far off from reality that is leading politics in some dangerous and candidly populist directions that will ultimately do more harm than good. That is true at the federal level and is absolutely true here in the state of California as well. So a bit of a mixed bag. Now, when you want to get right into the data on where the economy is, again, it's still growing. We keep hearing how about maybe we're already in a recession. We do know unemployment rate just came up just a little bit. But keep something in mind. For the last 8 quarters, the economy has averaged 2.8% growth per quarter. 8 quarters in a row, averaging almost 3% growth. That's a pretty good run, particularly in a labor force constrained economy. And in terms of that third quarter data, it looks like yet again we're going to have another 2.5% quarter, at least according to the GDP Now data from the Atlanta Federal Reserve. So the economy is moving, and it's moving forward largely on the basis of strong consumer spending. And it's not just that consumers are out there, getting by in the midst of high interest rates and high inflation. Quite the opposite. The data tells us that Americans are partying and partying hard. Foreign travel, an all-time high level. Europeans are absolutely, totally, utterly sick of us at this particular point in time. Nevada has never been busier. Gaming revenues at an all-time high level. Restaurant spending. Restaurant spending has increased, get this, 45%. 45% in the last 5 years. The previous 5 years, it went up by 15%. So restaurants are busy as they have ever been. The revenue's moving through them. Now, most restaurateurs will tell you this is not an easy time for them. I absolutely understand that, but it's not a function of demand. It's a function of trying to run that business under the cost circumstances that they're dealing with. If you want to be jealous about somebody's 10K, take a look at Live Nation. Every single concert they've been putting on has been selling out completely, including every single VIP package. Again, Americans are just having fun. Yes, we've seen a little bit of an uptick in credit card delinquencies. You certainly heard a lot about that. But that's kind of a blip in an otherwise overall very favorable picture. Take a look at the right-hand side. This is a much better encapsulation of American household financial conditions. Bankruptcies and foreclosures. If you're declaring bankruptcy, if you're losing your home because you can't pay your mortgage, this is the top-line sign of people in big financial trouble. And by the way, while these numbers are up, they're only up from the insanely low levels they were at back in 2020, and they are still at less than half of what they were prior to the pandemic back in 2019, when, by the way, bankruptcies and foreclosures were at a record low level. So from a top-line perspective, this looks great. And yes, that's true locally as well. It's an interesting data set we have. It's the share of the local population that has a subprime credit score, right? That said their credit conditions are not very good. Well, back in 2014, for example, here in Monterey County, about 28% of the population had a subprime credit score. Today, it's about 20%. That's very low. Yes, up just a little bit after the crazy days of 2021, but this suggests, yet again, people are in really good shape. We've heard a lot about labor market blues. We've seen a little less than a percentage point uptick in the unemployment rate in the United States. That goes back to that, there's a 40% chance we're already in a recession comment I just showed you, right? Because typically, the unemployment rate only goes up when the economy is actually slowing down dramatically. Well, on that front, it hasn't slowed down dramatically. I just told you that. 8 quarters, 2.8% growth, and a 2.5% growth in the quarter we're in right now. This is not a recession economy. And to be clear, we have seen an uptick in unemployment rate, but you haven't seen any other signals of a labor market that is starting to struggle from a lack of labor demand. For example, initial claims for unemployment insurance, basically not where they are now is where they were pre-pandemic, when they're, again, at very low levels. And in terms of the overall pace of layoffs, well, prior to the pandemic, the pace of layoffs and firings was about 1.2% per quarter. Right now, it's running about 1%. So even that suggests the labor markets actually are still quite tight. People aren't getting laid off. They're not losing their jobs. And in general, even with a little bit of cooling off we've seen, labor markets are still generally tight. If you look at overall job openings to the number of unemployed people, right now it's running about 1.3 to 1. Now that's a little cooler than it was a couple years ago when it was 2 to 1, but just as high as it was prior to the pandemic when it was a record high level. So labor markets may be cooling off a bit, but that's it. They're cooling off a bit. We're going from ultra hot to normal, not from normal to cold. It's a different kind of trend in the economy. You can certainly see that in wages. On the right-hand side, this is real hourly wage growth, and on an average, the average worker is seeing about a 4% increase in their earnings year over year in inflation-adjusted terms. That's inflation-adjusted. The median worker, about 2.5% to 2%. Good, solid numbers. Incomes are indeed growing faster than prices are. Industrial activity can remain strong, manufacturer orders are up, interest rates are up, but real business spending has been increasing. And that's particularly true for stuff that's important to California's economy. Software investment is up, research and development is up, information processing equipment up, entertainment and literary is down just a bit, but it's up from where it was prior to the pandemic. So again, good solid numbers here, particularly for the California economy. As for local commercial markets, it's interesting. You obviously, up the road, up to 17 from you, you have a lot of vacancy rates, particularly in San Jose and San Francisco. Not here in Monterey. Office vacancies are actually down a little bit. The actual problem you have in vacancies in Monterey is in the retail side of things, and that's because people are buying a lot of stuff online. You can blame Amazon warehouses for that more than the overall state of the economy. Also important is non-residential permit values. They've actually gone up a bit in Santa Cruz and San Luis Obispo. Monterey, they've been steady over the course of the last few years, but there's more investment going into local real estate. This is not a recessionary economy by any stretch of the imagination. Even the housing market. If you're a real estate agent, it is really tough right now. Very few sales out there, yet despite that, if you look at the overall number of existing home sales, we are where we are now, basically where we were back in 2008 from a market activity standpoint. It's a very tough market for real estate agents. But that's the only similarity between today and 2008, 2009. In fact, what's really interesting is consider this. In the last couple of years, mortgage rates went from 2.5% all the way up to 7.5%. They're cooling off a bit now, but all the way up to 7.5%. Home sales absolutely collapsed. Home prices went down for about 8 months, a couple percent, and they're rising again. And home prices are at an all-time high level. The real issue here in housing is not affordability, but an overall lack of supply. A lack of supply in terms of the month supply of existing units for sale, which is incredibly low because no one's selling, because they're all locked in on that 2.5% 30-year fixed rate mortgage. I got one of those, and you will pry it from my cold, dead hand. But the bigger issue is, there's not enough housing units in general. Overall housing vacancy rates are at record low level, whether we're looking at rental units or for sale units. So the lack of supply is exactly what's maintaining these high values. So there's not going to be a collapse in real estate. If anything, what we need to be doing is building more housing nationally here in California and particularly here in Monterey. That is a point I'm going to come back to over and over again. And again, looking at Monterey, the story here is not one of a collapsing housing market, but rather one in which there are just not enough units to actually buy. There's very few active listings, very few home sales, but prices are indeed rising. Unbelievable. In Santa Cruz, median prices getting back up to about $1.4 million. Consider that number. And here in Monterey County, of course, they're getting close to $1 million. So yeah, real estate prices are really high, but ultimately that's because demand is a lot bigger than supply. That is exactly what's keeping those home prices up right now. Now, the most important thing for our economy, of course, over the last couple of years has been the fact that inflation has cooled off pretty sharply, down to about 2%. Interest rates are also starting to subside just a little bit, and the Federal Reserve finally came through with those much promised rate cuts that we started talking about at the end of last year. They went down a full 0.5 percentage point. Now, I'm going to come back to this in just a little while and tell you it isn't quite as exciting news as you might think. But with that being said, clearly we seem to have turned a corner. Certainly confidence is rising. Consumer sentiment has been going up. The S&P 500 is at an all-time high level at this particular point in time. Even Bitcoin has come back. Have you seen this? Bitcoin is running $60,000 right now. Now, to be clear, I think this is a little higher than it should be, okay? We've done a lot of important studies in cryptocurrency, and we've determined that the Bitcoin is overvalued by, give or take about $60,000. That's where we're at this particular point in time. And if you're wondering about our assessment of the fundamental value of Bitcoin being zero, well, as opposed to diving into the technical details of it, I might put you to a book I read over the summer. It's a fantastic story of a guy named Charles Ponzi, an Italian-American. He lived about 100 years ago, right? It's a wonderful rags to riches to jail to deportation story of a true American entrepreneur, right? Now, this brings us back, of course, to full circle to what is going on out there. Because everything I just showed you about how good the economy is not what we hear. Yet, This is the reality that the data paints to me. And it's the basic reality that there are narratives and there are realities, and they do not necessarily fully overlap. And the positive value of Bitcoin is a great example of that, right? Now, snark aside, why do I think Bitcoin shouldn't have any value? There's a very simple reason for it, and it boils down to this. Any kid with a master's degree in computer science can make another cryptocurrency. If you could have infinite number of cryptocurrencies, none of them can be worth a damn, right? That's basic supply and demand. But with that being said, let's say, I don't know, I wanted to get a Bitcoin and store it on my computer for a future laugh. It's going to cost me $60,000. So that says, my logic be damned, there's a real value attached to that. Why? Well, don't ask me. Go to the websites. Go watch the videos. Watch the conversation, the logic, or illogic as the case may be, of the huge clouds of narratives thrown at this particular issue. I can't even get into it. But with all that being said, here's what happens. When all those narratives and all those stories come out, people start to believe in it. And when they start to believe in it, amazingly, you start to create value out of thin air. It's a neat trick. I wish I had thought of it. I wouldn't have to work anymore, right? But with that being said, it tells you the power of the narrative. And it's not new with cryptocurrency. How about gold? Gold prices have also gone up too. In fact, if you look at gold prices relative to what gold prices should be given actual industrial and commercial use for it, you very quickly come to the conclusion that gold is violently overvalued. Why? Well, gold is an inflation hedge. We all know that. What does that mean? Well, that means when inflation goes up, the price of gold goes up. True, but when the price of stuff goes up, well, the price of everything goes up. See what I'm saying? In other words, a chair is just as good of an inflation hedge as gold is. So why is gold so valuable? Well, 100 years ago, we used gold as the basis of our currency, right? We had a gold-backed system. Sure. And 100 years ago, we rode horses to work and we beat our children on a weekly basis, right? It was a different world. We're not going back to that world. Thus, gold shouldn't have this value. But the narrative remained, the story sticks, and lo and behold, gold and cryptocurrency violently overvalued. Am I telling you not to invest or invest in it? I'm not. If you want to run the gauntlet of narrative investments, have fun. For me, it scares me to death. Now, the other side of it, by the way, where you see economic realities with no narratives attached, well, that's the federal government deficit. We just came out with the numbers. Last fiscal year, our deficit was 6.2% of GDP. That is the largest deficit in a full employment America, since World War II. We are borrowing money like a drunk sailor on a short shore leave, right? And yet, our debt to GDP is 120% right now. And with all that being said, this is clearly a big problem. We have future obligations for Medicare and Social Security we can't possibly pay for. This is a problem. So it's intriguing to me. Let's go. Who watched the debates the other night? Anyone? Did you watch the debates? Great. Wow. Holy cow. I usually don't get that kind of response. Okay, so they went on for like an hour, 90 minutes. Just work with me. How many minutes of that debate were devoted to the national deficit? And zero. Zero. It was unbelievable. It's just completely undiscussed at every level. And by the way, that's exactly why I say this is economic reality without narrative. It's so easy to poke fun at our presidential candidates and go, oh man, those people are so out of touch with reality. They're absolutely in touch with reality. Understand what politicians do is sell narratives. If you want to get elected, you need to sell the right narrative, period. So if they're not talking about the deficit, it's because they've determined that we don't care about the deficit. It's a reflection of what we're thinking, of our narrative. Americans don't think it's important, ergo, our politicians don't think it's important. That is dangerous, because at some point in time, reality will rain on this parade, and what happens then? Well, that remains to be seen. And this is why when you think about the world, you have to constantly go back to this concept of narratives and understanding how important narratives are to everything. You see them skewing our interpretation of economic news at the root of these economic bubbles, driving bad policy choices. There's no mistake. There's no mistake about this. A couple of years ago, Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote a book called Narrative Economics. And in this book, he made this comment: we need to incorporate the contagion of narratives in economic theory, otherwise we remain blind to a very real mechanism for economic change. Hear, hear. It's all about the narrative. You hear it all the time, right? It's the economy, stupid, right? It's not. It's the narrative, stupid. That's what's really important, right? Now, with all this being said, there's nothing new said under the sun. This is not new, actually. One of my favorite California philosophers, a guy named Will Rogers, and he said over 100 years ago, it isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble, it's what we know that ain't so. Now, he's talking about broken narratives. So this is common human knowledge. It's just modern economics that have pulled us away from this fundamental understanding of what humans are and how our perception of the world can be considerably off base from realities. And that, of course, explains exactly how we got into this position in the first place. It all goes back to the pandemic. Now, the pandemic was a tragic human circumstance. We were stuck inside for a year. Millions of people passed. Obviously, it created an enormous disturbance within our economy. But with all that being said, it was not an existential threat to our economy. I mean, look at these crazy headlines we saw in 2020. 10 years of depression and debt. Home prices are going to collapse. Make no mistake, this has morphed into a depression-like crisis. No, it hasn't. In fact, the idea that the pandemic was going to cause a depression is nonsensical. There's no evidence that any pandemic has ever caused an economic depression. Go back to the Spanish flu, which was a heck of a lot worse than, of course, the COVID pandemic. It didn't cause a depression. Nothing of the sort. What were we talking about? Well, we were talking about, of course, well, a narrative that wasn't based on reality. It simply fed people's fears. And those fears were not just people in their homes, it was everybody in Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C., when they got ramped up to go and fix the world, and they did so on the basis of one of the most enormous stimulus packages you could have possibly put together. Now, to be clear, the pandemic didn't turn out to be a big deal. In fact, it was the quintessential V. Yes, Q2 of 2020, worst quarter of economic decline ever seen, a 9% decline in economic activity. We've never seen anything like it. But that was it. This was the deepest recession in U.S. economic history and the shortest. I'm not kidding. It was February to May. It was 10 weeks. That's it. And by June, the economy was rocketing back. Absolutely rocketing back. By the beginning of 2021, the economy was fine. But did any of that make it into Washington, D.C.'s collective narrative? Not even close. Let's put this in context. The pandemic cost the U.S. economy about $1.2 trillion in economic output or income, as the case may be. They're roughly the same thing. In return for our troubles, we had $6 trillion. $6 trillion of stimulus thrown at the economy. $5 of stimulus for every dollar of lost income. And by the way, that adds up to $50,000 for every single American household. Wow. You talk about an overreaction. Now, most of this, by the way, was funded by, of course, the Federal Reserve through quantitative easing. $5 trillion of the $6 trillion was funded by a brand new issuance of wonderful, brand new U.S. American dollars. And that, of course, caused the money supply to increase by something in the order of 40%. Well, no wonder we came out of the pandemic like a rocket, just rocketing out of there. I mean, look at the increase in spending we've seen over the last 4 years. Overall, about a 32% increase in nominal spending. This includes inflation, as the case be. The biggest increases in spending, air transportation up 113%. Foreign travel, sporting goods, supplies, and guns. That one scares me a little. Recreational items, food services, that's restaurants, up 51%. Garments, 40%. You want to get to the necessities, drop to the bottom. Housing, 30%. Pharmaceuticals, 25%. Food from supermarkets, 24%. The biggest increase in spending was not on necessities, it was on fun stuff. We were having a great time. Now, lots of demand, lots of excess cash, that equals inflation. That is how it works. In fact, one of the oldest cliches in economics is this one by Milton Friedman. Inflation is nothing more than the consequence of too many dollars chasing too few goods. Over and over and over. How many times have you heard in the last 4 years about how inflation has crushed the American consumer? that is completely back-asswards, as they say, right? It's completely reversed. It's not how it works. It's demand that drives inflation. It's as simple as that. It is an effect, not a cause. It was all that demand that was pushing up prices, not the other way around. But of course, we had the story completely backwards because the story followed our personal narrative, where we pay a lot more attention to prices than we do to our actual consumption. That is a standard human condition. Now, the Federal Reserve, of course, had to deal with inflation. After all, they caused it, so they had to get rid of it. And they cranked up the federal funds rate. They got that up above 5%, but they also engaged in quantitative tightening. Quantitative tightening is the opposite of quantitative easing, is when they start selling off some of those bonds to shrink the overall money supply, and it worked. Higher interest rates, getting rid of the money supply, has cooled off the overall rate of inflation. And it also, of course, explains a lot of the fluctuations in consumer spending over the course of the last couple of years. Look, if you want to talk about consumer spending, at the very beginning was the pandemic implosion. Can't go out, can't buy anything, stuck at home, no one can buy anything. Uh-oh, what do we do now? But then $5 trillion in brand new cash is lobbed at the economy. That plus the vaccine set off this enormous surge in demand, the giant bounce back that led, of course, to the big inflationary surge. The back end of that, of course, well, prices started to come up, interest rates started to come up, the Fed started shrinking the money supply, and that cooled everything off. That was, remember that existential panic about a recession beginning of 2023? That was really about those Fed efforts starting to shrink overall demand, cooling off to normal levels, thus getting rid of inflation, and now we're settling in back into what you might call getting back to normal. And getting back to normal means obviously getting your spending back in line with your income, not quite the craziest a couple of years ago. It also means moving away from goods, which was the big part of the spending, and shifting it back towards services, because at the very beginning of this, well, most of the stuff we were buying was goods because we couldn't get on a plane. We couldn't go to our favorite restaurant. And you can see that, for example, in California sales tax receipts. Look at the enormous increase in the back end of the recession. That's, of course, caused by price increases, but also people buying lots and lots and lots of goods. Since then, they're going back to buying services. Taxable sales has settled out a bit, but the numbers are substantially higher than they were prior to the pandemic because of the increase in prices and because of the overall increase in real spending. Now, if you take a look at here in Monterey, it's kind of a very similar picture over the course of the last year. Overall taxable sales at about 0.7%, basically flat, but up about 23% from pre-pandemic. The good news is the biggest source, of course, of spending over the course of the last year has been restaurants and hotels. So you can see the slow but steady return of tourism to the area. General consumer goods are there. The things that have cooled off a bit, business and industry, building and construction, and food and drugs. So a bit of a shift, but overall spending remaining relatively steady. And ultimately, while we get back to normal, keep something in mind. The outlook for consumers is still strong. That's why we say we're not going to have a recession anytime in the near future. Real disposable incomes continue to rise in the United States. And the other thing that's really driving consumer spending in the U.S. is overall net worth. Here's one of the things I didn't talk about because you got to put things in order. But when the Federal Reserve lobbed that $5 trillion to the economy, not only did it set off an enormous surge in consumer spending, but it also set off an enormous surge in asset prices. Remember, home prices went up by 50%, the stock market went up by 50%, crypto went up by 80%. All these asset prices just zoom forward. And that created a little bit more momentum than the Federal Reserve was counting on. Let me put this in context. The $5 trillion in brand new money turned into $35 trillion of household net worth. $35 trillion of household net worth. An enormous amount. And no, it didn't all go to the top 1%. In fact, if you look across the population, the increase in net worth for the bottom 50% was higher than the increase for the top 50%. So a lot of course, new net worth. And what's more intriguing is the Federal Reserve got into the bandwagon. They're shrinking the money supply. They cause interest rates to come up. They're pulling down price inflation, but they have not cooled off the financial markets. When we had the slowdown a year and a half ago, financial markets briefly dipped, but they've come roaring back. And now Americans are ahead by $47 trillion, 46% above where they were back in 2019. This is why consumers continue to spend. They feel rich, and this is what continues to drive the show. And they feel rich without having to worry about debt. You know, in the run-up to the Great Recession, people had a lot of debt as well as a lot of wealth. This time, the debt is all being held by the federal government. We have relatively low debt levels. I know credit card debt's coming up just a little bit, but keep something in mind. Prior to the Great Recession, credit card debt was 8% of disposable income. Today, it's 5%. And of course, if you look at overall household debt servicing, go back to what I said, most American consumer debt is in the form of a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. The average 30-year fixed-rate mortgage right now is running at about 4%. Ergo, most households don't have a big debt problem from a servicing standpoint either. So no, we're not debt constrained. This all says lots of consumer spending. Now, this is not what you've heard. You've heard all sorts of other things about the economy, but not this, right? In fact, this is a standard survey that came a year and a half ago. 85% of Americans are feeling the impact of inflation in day-to-day lives. I love this, right? Now, how? We're all suffering from inflation. Go to the second bullet. A similar number, 88%, said inflation has impacted their spending on restaurants. Now, I just showed you the data. Depending on whether you're looking at retail sales or the consumer spending data, restaurant spending is up 45 to 50%. Yet 88% of people say they're spending less at restaurants. How does this square? Well, there's really only one of two ways. The first way is those other 12% people are spending a lot of time in restaurants. Probably not. More likely, of course, what's really going on here is this is a survey. And what you're getting in surveys is not reality, but narratives, right? People see the prices at restaurants, but they don't calculate how many times they go out. So they say they're spending less, when in fact they're spending more. So when you really get down to it, what you have to recognize, what you have to remember, is surveys capture narratives. They don't capture realities. And those narratives, of course, get pushed in all sorts of weird directions by this kind of chaos. Even today, 70% of consumers feel inflation outpacing income. I just showed you the data. Not true. But this is what we think, and this is what's driving our narratives. And it's not just surveys. Even the publications, even good news publications, The Economist magazine, right? I'm required to read that. It's called The Economist, right? But this is an article at the beginning of the year. Could the inflation nightmare soon be over? What nightmare? The fact that I can't get a reservation for my favorite restaurant? Or the fact that my brand new BMW 7 Series is going to take 6 months to get delivered to me? What nightmare are we talking about? How do narratives go astray? How do we end up in these weird places? Well, there's a lot to talk about here, but it boils down to the fact that, and there's a wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman wrote this well over a decade ago. Daniel Kahneman was a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. His profound insight into how people make decisions. And what he points out is that, we always think about our type 2 system. That's our smart, rational system, the type of system that helps us fill out our income taxes or figure out what's the heart of an atom, right? This system, we think about, it's us, it's our core rational being, and we think of this as driving the show when it comes to how we make decisions, how we feel about the world. But in fact, our type 2 system, as he points out, is limited. We can only think about one hard thing at a time, and even then we can only do it for so long before we get tired. Well, if your type 2 system isn't operating, what is? And he talks about the type 1 system. And the type 1 system is your old-fashioned system. It's instinctual, it's quick, it's fast, but it's filled with all sorts of cognitive biases where we start to see things in ways that aren't quite true. And then we can go the next step and start talking about work by, say, Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind, where he talks about, and there are particular issues, particular things that cause our type 1 thinking to really take over, as the case may be. The story here boils down to the fact that we don't think as much as we think we think. By the way, if you're wondering what this is, you're in the back of the room. This is a whole bunch of people going to 24-hour fitness up the escalator. See what I'm saying? Not quite the brightest thing. Now, of course, the key here, again, going back to the type 2, type 1 system, is ultimately we think the rider's in control. We think that type 2 system, your rational system, is driving the show. But it's not. It's your type 1 thinking, the emotional thinking, that's really in charge. The rider thinks they're in control, but the reality is when the elephant wants to go that way, the elephant's going to go that way. And when you think of all these headlines, what are we constantly seeing in the paper? Downturn, recession, stagnation, inequality, decline. It goes on and on and on. And what happens is even though your type 2 system has the capacity to look at the data and realize this isn't true, your type 1 system just starts internalizing it, and it makes you scared. It makes you nervous. It makes Americans feel like, yeah, the end is nigh, when in fact it's not. And this is probably the best graph I can show you to get down to this. This is a survey by the Federal Reserve where they ask a whole bunch of people, well, what do you think's happening in our economy? How is it going for you? And that's the top line. How are you doing? And you got like a scale of 1 to 100, and this is the average. And back in 2017, 2018, 75% of people said, the average was 75%. People thought they were 75% okay, so to speak. Well, today it's 72%. In other words, the average person feels like they're doing just as well as they were back in 2019. But what's really interesting is when you ask people about how they think other people are doing. And that's that big decline over there. So the average person feels like they're doing just as well they were in 2017 and 2018. But the average person thinks the average person isn't. Now, that doesn't work that way. That boils down to that old saying that 90% of drivers think they're above average. Doesn't work like that. But this is where our nation's at. Even the labor market situation, right? We all probably heard about how we're going to be a big decline in overall jobs. But the reality is we actually have too many jobs. What's intriguing, if you look at the data over the last couple of years, we've added about 4.3 million people to our labor force, only 3 million people to our household employment. That left us with 2 million ghost jobs. We had jobs being filled by people that didn't seem to exist. Even when you had the big revision downwards, it turns out we still have 1 million jobs being filled by people that don't exist. Filling these jobs? Well, it turns out we have a lot more immigration than the official numbers would have us believe. The official numbers say about 1 million people a year are coming here. The unofficial data is 3 million people per year. Tons of people come to the United States because of our tight labor markets and job opportunities. And yes, most of these people are coming in through the southern border, and they are not documented. But with that being said, the big problem in our economy over the last few years has been a lack of labor force. And you know, this is an article in the Washington Post. The economy is roaring. Immigration is a key reason. They're here filling jobs, they're here making money, and they're here buying stuff. In other words, it is solving a problem in the U.S. economy. Now, I get it. I don't like them coming over the border in undocumented fashion. I'd like to have a little more control over the situation. But our legal system's broken. Our legal system is broken, ergo, this is how they are coming. This is the reality of the current circumstances. What's intriguing, of course, is most people think this is a big problem. And not really. Not really. This is something we need, our nation needs. But isn't it bad for inequality? We have those immigrants coming here, as the case may be. This is one of those stories, a baffling academic feud over income inequality. But even here, guess what? Tight labor markets are good, particularly for low-skilled, low-paid workers. It's not just the last couple of years, but since 2014, the bottom quartile of earners has seen more income growth than the top quartile of earners. And if you want to see that in action, take a look at the cost of labor, particularly for things like childcare and accommodation, personal services. These prices are going up a lot in these areas because labor costs are going up. Now, again, this is a good thing. The fact that lower income earners are getting ahead in life is good for our economy. There's no doubt about it. It is happening. The problem is we're not acknowledging it, as the case may be. What about Gen Z, right? I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. In fact, I want to get to the local stuff here relatively quickly. But even here, we hear about how the young are doing so terrible, right? Gen Z is true. This came from Scott Galloway. Today's 25-year-olds make less than their parents and grandparents. They carry student debt loads unimaginable to early generations. You've heard this, right? But just stop. Turn off your type 1 thinking. Use type 2 for a second. 25-year-olds today make less than their grandparents? Huh? Are you saying a 25-year-old today has a worse quality of life than a 25-year-old in 1974? I'm sorry. Face value, that's stupid. But your type 1 system absorbs it and doesn't question it. But that's a real problem. Look, turns out incomes for Gen Z are going up and going up nicely. In fact, the net worth for 35 and 44-year-olds, highest it's ever been. Highest it has ever been for that generation of kids. No, they're not suffering, but we think they are. And this is the kind of narratives that drive crazy politics. Go to the next step. It isn't just the actual data on consumption. How about all the stuff we don't count? Life expectancy higher, infant mortality down, crime rates are down, poverty rates are down. How about the fact that today everybody has a smartphone? This smartphone gives you infinite access to entertainment, information, and communication with anybody on this world. When I was a kid, this is a smartphone. Remember those? Right? Or how about a flat screen, fancy TV today? You can watch whatever you want. This is a TV when I was a kid, right? And if you wanted to watch Doctor Who, you got to wait till 3 o'clock in the morning on Saturday because that's the only time they played it, right? Today, of course, we can watch every single Doctor Who in a row, and by doing so, you realize it was never a terribly good series in the first place. You didn't have to fix cars when I was a kid. They just blew up on impact. It was easy, right? Today we have these amazing cars that look wonderful, drive forever, last forever. Again, the changes in our world are unbelievable. Even dieting. Remember how hard it used to be? Now you get a shot, you lose 20 pounds. It's easy. What are we talking about? But with that being said, here's reality. Kids are suffering. Suicide rates are up. Abuse, drug abuse, overdose deaths are up. People are miserable. They are. Don't blame the economy. It's not the economy. If you have any kids in your life, read this book, The Anxious Generation, came out earlier this year, an insanely good book about how we are doing this to ourselves by creating false narratives driven by, of course, the internet itself. And what it's doing to kids in particular is truly scary. Don't blame the economy. So with all that, what about housing? They can never afford housing, right? But even here, you know what's interesting? Housing over the last decade, prior to the Great Recession, never been cheaper. Let me repeat. Once you account for low interest rates, in 2019, housing had never been cheaper. What is going on? Why weren't people buying homes like crazy? Because we were telling them it was so expensive. Again, the power of the narrative. Why was housing so cheap in 2019? Because we told people it was so expensive. Now, that all turned, of course, in the midst of that huge stimulus package that broke that cycle that caused housing to go up 50%, and interest rates came up, and yeah, today it's modestly more expensive. But with that being said, look at this. People's opinion about buying homes have never been worse, when in fact affordability today is better than it was in 1983 or 1984, when, by the way, there was all sorts of things. And of course, the real issue, as already noted, is the overall lack of supply. And that's the two things that narrative drove. Narratives caused people to not buy homes when they should have, and that caused builders not to build homes when they should have. Today, we have expensive homes and not enough stock because of that broken narrative over and over again. And that explains why new home sales are still solid. I'm not going to worry about this later. I'm going to go move on. I want to get to local stuff. What about our economy? What about California, right? Where are we? Now, again, it depends on who you ask. If you ask the right, our state is failing. It's failing because of our socialist policies that are driving businesses and rich people out of the state. And then, of course, if you listen to the left, we are also told we're a failing state. But in this case, we're failing our workers. Screaming inequality, screaming housing costs, driving, of course, low-income people out of the state. And I like to point out, oh, wait a minute, are we a capitalist hellhole or are we a socialist hellhole? Can someone figure that out for me? Because I don't think we can be both, right? Isn't it one or the other? But of course, you have a third opinion on this. It's the governor. And the governor says, oh, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Nothing to see here. Move on, folks. And I promise I'm not running for president. I swear I'm not. Well, if I had to choose here, which is right, it's the governor. He's right. The economy is largely fine. It is okay. Now, I get it. Our job growth isn't as fast as, say, for example, Arizona or Texas. Unemployment's been rising here more than other places. But with that said, our output growth is greater. Business applications are still strong in the state. Our travel is coming back. You can see airport traffic in the state coming back. Monterey's airport is busy yet again. Take a look at hotels, better numbers there. In fact, the overall RevPAR here in Monterey County, it says about $170, a good solid growth rate, about what it was last year because tourism's coming back. Our premium. Californians make more than the rest of the nation on average, and that gap between us and the rest of the country is getting larger. Median household incomes in California are growing faster than Florida and Texas. So maybe we're not growing as fast on the extensive margin, but we're growing faster on the intensive margin. More productivity, more income, our economy seems to be doing well. The big issue is our labor force isn't growing. This is the biggest issue of all. And think of it this way. In the last 5 years, our labor force has grown by 13,000. Our state has added 640,000 jobs. So again, it's not quite what you think. Now, with all that being said, why is the population declining? Because that has been a big story of the last couple of years. And there's no doubt the population is going down. But understand, when you think about the narrative, what is the narrative attached to this story? People are fleeing. They're fleeing the state of California. We hear that all the time. Now, that's an important word, fleeing. Because if you say fleeing, that means people are voluntarily leaving. And if they are voluntarily leaving, well, what must be happening to housing vacancy rates? They should be going up. Fleeing equals more housing vacancy rates. Yet when you look a little closer, housing vacancy rates have never been lower in California. They've never been lower in Monterey County. What is happening here? How can this be? Well, here's the answer. Dirty little secret. We have fewer people in California. We have more households in California. More households, fewer people. That means a big decline in people per household. That's driving the show. Why are we seeing a decline in people per household? Well, there's two reasons for it. One reason is people are doing better. And when you do better, you spread out. You don't live with your family. You don't live with roommates. You live on your own. The other thing that's happening, of course, is that we have a big shift. We have a big change in our population and the structure of our population. We have people who are house insensitive moving here. Think young, educated, high-income people without kids. And who's leaving? Anybody who's more house price sensitive, which tend to be lower income folks or families with kids. So yet again, all of this says that the real issue here is we have a good economy with a limited housing stock. And when people are spreading out, someone has to get out. And that means they get out of state, or they're moving away from the coast inland, or worst case scenario, they become homeless. And yet again, the narratives of homelessness are entirely broken. We're told we have homelessness because renters are doing terrible. Actually, you have rising homelessness because renters are doing well. Renters are doing well, they're expanding, and as a result of those people who are always on the margins of society used to be able to afford a flop house. We didn't see them, they were always there, but now that flop house has been converted to nice apartments, and they are in the alley. And until you recognize that, until you recognize that the problem here is that renters, for the most part, are doing well, you're not going to fix this. Because we're talking about things like rent control, which, by the way, causes people to expand more. And eviction moratoriums, which causes people to expand more, which pushes more people into the street. The only way you're going to fix homelessness is by fixing the people who are homeless and expanding the housing stock. And those are two completely different kind of policy choices we have to make. And of course, again, with that lack of housing supply growth, you can see the overall changes in our economy. A lot of skilled people moving here, lower skilled people moving out. As a result of that, huge growth of people with bachelor degrees and grad degrees, but of course, fewer people on the other end of things. But with that being said, understand that low-skilled people, while they may be moving out, their lower quantity is actually really good for wages. Take a look at the right-hand side here. This is overall income growth from 2019 to 2022. And the biggest increase in earning growth are for people with a high school degree or less than a high school degree. So the lack of low-skilled workers, the overall increase in demand has actually given these folks who are remaining a big lift, which is why they can afford these higher rates. And you can certainly see that even locally here, where average weekly wages in Monterey, for the record, in this graph, you'll see sometimes Salinas, sometimes Monterey. Remember that Salinas is your MSA name, right? It's the biggest city. So Salinas is the MSA name, Monterey County, for Monterey County. You can see, of course, the Salinas wages here. Back in 2015, wages were running about $800 a week. Today, they're $1,100 a week. Think of that. Almost doubling in a decade, as the case may be. And yet again, take a look at the left-hand side here. You can see over the course, this is 2023 data, just came out. Looking over since 2019 to 2023, in Monterey County, folks without a high school degree have seen a 26% increase in their earnings. Those with a grad or professional degree, 11%. So yes, income inequality is falling faster here than it is in the state overall. So it's not a conversation about income inequality. It is a big story about a lack of housing, which is leading to a lack of labor force. And again, take a look at this data. I'm going to come back to this over and over and over again. If you look at the various places, there's been almost no labor force growth in Monterey County from the various areas that you can see here. This over and over becomes the biggest issue. What you start to recognize is the problem we have in California is a lack of housing supply growth. And for all the new rules and all the regulations and all the laws and all the rhetoric coming out of Sacramento, they've accomplished nothing on the housing supply front. Nothing. This state continues to produce roughly 9,000 housing permits per month. They've been doing that ever since 2014, 2015. For a decade, we are still stuck with 9,000 permits per month. We are not expanding our housing stock. And when you think about, for example, apartments, we're talked all about how apartments are becoming more expensive. Well, there was a surge, but actually things have sort of flattened out. You can see on the left-hand side there, this is rents in Monterey, Santa Cruz, and San Luis Obispo. You can see they flattened out. And more importantly, on the right-hand side, this is median rent-to-income ratios here in Monterey County. Guess what? They've been more or less steady since 2009. Why have they been steady? It's a very simple reason. Rents go up because renter incomes are going up. Renters are doing better here, and that pushes rents up. The only way you can get ahead of this game is by having more rental supply coming online than people who want to live in rental housing units. And that means you got a lot to build, which is not happening. The housing story is so critical. We always talk about in the state, there's a term we always use. We always look at rent-to-income ratios, right? Take a look at Monterey. It's down there at the bottom. You can see Monterey's rent-to-income ratio in 21-22 was about 31%. That's about the same as the national average overall, lower than Marin County or Ventura County, as the case may be. We put that to one side. I'm tired of rent-to-income ratios as being a metric that we should use. That's not relevant. What's really relevant is how much money do you make when you pay, after you paid your rent? And take a look on the bottom there. Back in 11-12 in Monterey County, the average renter made $28,000 after they paid the rent. In 21-22, it was $48,000. It increased dramatically. So renters are not doing bad. They have more money left over after paying the rent than ever before. This isn't the story. Yet, what's the big thing? Prop 33. Yes for more rent control. What a disaster. What a disaster. You need more rental units, not rent control. And you're not going to get more rental units if the state starts going heavily down the path to more rent control. That is only making the situation worse. It scares me a lot. What about overall earnings? Well, yet again, I told you the numbers are up. Look at poverty rates over here. Poverty rates in California are at an all-time low level. Yet we're constantly seeing headlines like this. Nearly a third of Californians are living near poverty. Well, I actually called PPIC. I said, I'm a little confused. A third? Because as far as I'm today, the official rate's 12%. How do you get a third? Well, we raised the poverty line. What? Well, we made the poverty line higher. You can't just do that. You can't unilaterally raise it to whatever you want. Oh, okay, never mind. We'll use the higher level. What's poverty rate now? Well, it's the lowest it's ever been. Well, why doesn't your headline say that? Because we're too busy trying to influence the narrative rather than giving people a realistic construct of what's actually happening here. Right? We're not talking about it right. And that's true with this minimum wage, which is another big part of things going on, right? We've seen this whole thing on the FAST Act, $20 per minute for restaurants. And of course, now we have Prop 32, which is about the minimum wage. What are we doing here? Why are we going down this path? Well, it's because we're told inequality is a problem when it's not. Well, in any case, restaurants aren't suffering. We know restaurant employment's going up despite the fact that they're paying $20 an hour. It's not. It's not. Yeah, the official numbers say it is, but remember, those numbers will get revised next year. And it doesn't catch closures, and we know there's a lot of franchises closing right now. If you look at the CPS numbers, employment in restaurants is actually going down in California. Expect a big revision on that. And as for that increase in the unemployment rate in California, well, yet again, it's not the fact that people are getting laid off. The initial claims for unemployment in the state are on an all-time low level. What's really going on in unemployment? Kids. Kids aren't getting jobs. The unemployment rate for kids right now in California is above 20%. This is why we're seeing increased unemployment rate. Why is that? Well, most of them work in restaurants. And restaurants aren't hiring right now. And if they are going to hire for $20 an hour, they're not going to give a 16-year-old that job, particularly not a minority 16-year-old. They're going to go get an adult. And so suddenly, kids, particularly those who are at risk, from at-risk communities, these are the ones not getting jobs. And this is important because having a job when you're a teenager is a critical component to increasing your lifetime success. So we're cranking up the minimum wage to solve a problem that doesn't exist, and we're creating a problem that didn't before we decided to do this. The power of the narrative over and over again. Now, what about in the Central Coast? Where are things here? And Monterey is actually one of the stronger economies from an overall job growth perspective. There are more jobs in Monterey County today than there were prior to the pandemic. In Santa Cruz and San Luis Obispo, it's lower. There are actually fewer number of jobs. But with that being said, where are those jobs? Over the course of the last, there's only been about 1,400 jobs created here in the non-farm payroll fronts, about 1% growth. Now, I want you to take a look on the left-hand side, because it does give you a little bit of a breakdown what's happening year over year here in Monterey County, and it tells us some interesting things. First of all, look at leisure and hospitality. That's up about 1.3%. Obviously, tourism, a big part of the local economy. It's got a location quotient in the non-farm part of the economy, about 1.7. Leisure and hospitality is 70% higher here in this county than the standard county in California. You can also go down to the bottom, government. That's a very high source of things. Remember, that's because of all the government institutes here. That's a big number, as the case may be. Government jobs actually coming down a bit, but of course, leisure and hospitality is coming back. But the real number here is on the right-hand side. You know, what's interesting here about Monterey is that while you think of all the things, the Monterey Bay, insanely beautiful coastline, the incredibly beautiful houses in Carmel by the Sea that will soon have housing numbers, and of course, you obviously the golf resorts and all, you got it, right? I mean, this place is absolutely stunning. But when you look at Monterey, it's an ag county. It is ag, ag, ag. A third of the jobs in the county are in agriculture. That is enormous. And you can even see in the top subsectors here. This is some of the data from the QCW. Support activities for agriculture, crop production. These are the biggest sources of employment in the area. And you can certainly see ag in terms of the distribution. You haven't seen a lot of growth in large companies. It's mainly in small companies, which is very standard for an ag-type economy. And if you look at ag, it's been doing wonderfully, right? We know that. It's coming back, lots of new jobs, as the case may be. And how big of an ag economy is this? This blew me away. You probably knew this, but I did not until I grabbed these numbers. Did you know that Monterey County is the biggest ag county in the entire nation? Entire nation, all right? Enormous, right? and the number 2 is Fresno, number 3 is Tulare. So California's got the big ones, as the case may be. But even there, number 2 is Fresno, and Monterey is almost 30% larger than Fresno is. So this is an ag economy. It's about 20% of the overall economy, as the case may be. Crop production, very solid, as the case may be. And we know that prices came up very strongly over the past couple of years, which is one of the reasons why farmers are doing well. They're also doing well because of all that immigration. A couple of years ago, every farmer I met in the state was telling me they couldn't hire enough people to get their damn crops out of the field. Today, there are lots of workers, and we know why, because of all that immigration. This is all great. It's wonderful, with one basic issue. Labor force. Labor force. There's been no labor force growth in this county. There's actually declining labor force in San Luis Obispo and Santa Cruz. Nothing. Labor force has been contracting. Why is this a big issue? Well, take a look at these numbers. In the last 5 years, ag employment in the county has gone up by 5,000 jobs. That's 7%. Every other sector of the economy combined has added 2,900 jobs, which is 2%. Now, what's going on here is what we call Dutch disease. And let me explain, just give me a couple seconds. And it's interesting why we call it the Dutch disease. Here is the issue. When you are a commodity economy, the ebbs and flows of that commodity can impact the rest of your economy, particularly when you have constrained labor forces. And it's called Dutch disease because it's written about the Netherlands in the 1950s and 1960s. In the 50s, Netherlands was an enormous manufacturing area, one of the strongest in Europe, as the case may be. By the 60s, they had lost their manufacturing base. What happened? The answer is oil. They discovered oil in the North Sea, and lo and behold, then the Dutch holdings of it, and that became an enormous commodity for the Netherlands. Tons of money moved in to build all those oil rigs, to pull oil out of the ground and sell it into the global markets, which made a ton of money in the Dutch economy. But what did it do? It yanked all of their workers out of the manufacturing sector. And the manufacturing sector collapsed behind it, which is maybe fine in the short run, but the problem with commodities is they ebb and flow. They go up and down. And so what happened when oil prices went down, they lost the commodity part of the economy, and manufacturing was no longer there to provide a buffer for them. This is known as Dutch disease, and it is a common problem for commodity-based economies, whether it's the Netherlands, as the case may be, or something like Namibia and their diamond mines, or Norway and their oil, or equivalently Monterey and agriculture, as the case may be. When ag expands, it takes the life out of everything else in the economy, and that's driven by the fact that you don't have housing stock growth, which means you can't have labor force growth. How is an entrepreneur supposed to start a new business here? When you get your business going, you're hiring some people, then bam, the next thing you know, there's a hot couple years in terms of crops. Any available housing is suddenly being filled up by farm workers, and there's no one left for you to hire. You can't expand your business, and by definition, you are forced to leave. So ag is an enormous benefit to the community, but understand that the Dutch disease, driven by the lack of housing, I cannot emphasize this enough. Netherlands had the problem because, it was its own country. In this case, you've created your own country because of the unwillingness to expand housing stock sufficiently to make room for both your ag economy as well as your non-ag economy. And that means when ag surges, your non-ag economy is going to suffer. And, well, again, how do you get ahead of the game? How do you promote? How do you diversify? How do you make this economy both continue to emphasize ag and all the positives there, but also allow the non-ag part of the economy to continue to lift and grow as well to provide that buffer in periods of time when ag isn't doing all that well? It's a big question, and one that can only be answered by, again, expanding housing supply. And, this is some data in terms of ag employment. We broke the data down by districts and by different cities. You can see ag and tourism employment where they are here. Obviously, you think about Monterey, Salinas, and Carmel by the Sea as being the big places for overall tourism employment. But when, of course, you're looking at ag, District 2, District 3, this is the big places for ag employment, as the case may be. And there's going to be this constant tension between these two parts of the local economy because of the lack of housing. And it's interesting because we know, of course, that they got rid of Airbnb recently, which means the area has a dearth of new hotels. Okay, bring the new hotels online. A lot of new ones, about 1,000 new units coming online, which is fantastic. But here's my question. Who's going to work here? Who are they going to hire? And where are they going to live? Because I tell you what, they're not going to commute from Santa Cruz, and they're sure as hell not going to commute from San Luis Obispo. Well, they can't get here anyway. Separate issue. You see what I'm saying, right? So it becomes a housing stock conversation, and that goes back to the idea of population. So the population in Monterey County right now is 440,000. It's bigger than it was 2002, but more or less has been flat over the last 5 or 6 years, as the case may be. It's not just here. It's a general problem across the area, but obviously driven by the lack of housing. And you can see some of the distortions. Here's some of the data on population by age. And look, for example, the 65 and older. Up in the last decade, that has grown by 30%. These are retirees, which is great. Retirees, they have money, they're going to spend money, they're going to be a big part of the economy, but because you don't have enough housing stock, every time you have one retired household here, that's one less housing unit that you can put employees in. So yet again, you can start to see this constant stress. You have businesses, you have retirees, and you have farms all competing for this limited housing stock. And it's just really complicated. Even in terms of the age, right? Same sort of picture there. How about by educational attainment? This is really interesting. Take a look at the bottom. This is overall changes in shares. In Monterey County, there's been a 6.5% increase in people without a high school degree. These are your ag workers. And a 39% increase in people with a graduate degree or more. There's your retirees who can afford to retire here. And of course, your young folks who maybe kind of attached to the tech economy up to 17 from you, who obviously have great skills and maybe would love to start a business here. But everybody in the middle don't exist. So you have this hollow point in the middle of your skill distribution. Yet again, it's critical. It's a critical issue for getting your local businesses off the ground over and over again. And even from, of course, the conversation of household incomes, where you see a huge increase in high-income households, and lower at the lower end, less at the lower end. That's great news. But again, you can see the constraints on the overall economy. So where are residential permits on this particular front? Well, 2022 was a great year for residential permits, and now you're getting back to more normal constraint levels. And it's just enough. And what's interesting is we always talk about this from a single-family side, but I'm going to go back to the conversation I had a little while ago about multifamily. Because the real solution here is multifamily. I cannot emphasize that enough. It's multifamily. You need tons of apartments. And they can be cheap with the right zoning. It's unbelievable. Oh, we need more affordable housing units. And they go in and build an affordable housing unit, and it costs $700,000 and $800,000 a key. It's insanity. But if you talk to an actual developer, private sector developer, they would tell you, you give me some relatively loose restrictions. I can do a 3-story apartment building with a parking lot in front, not subterranean parking, normal building. I can do that for $200,000 a key. But that means allowing the space and zoning to build the 3-story apartment building with a parking lot in front. And that's nigh unto impossible in this zoning and regulatory and planning environment. So the one thing you've absolutely pushed out. Now, it's not to say that things aren't being completely built. I mean, obviously, Marina's been doing great, 528 jobs there, some unincorporated county. But again, it's just not enough. You need a lot more than this, a lot more. And unfortunately, at this point in time, I'm just not seeing those restrictions liven up. So again, ag is doing well, but it makes the rest of your economy really start to suffer. You look around where housing units are, well, again, just not enough growth. Some places are doing better. Salinas, Seaside, I'm sorry, not so Seaside, but Salinas is doing up, as the case may be. Marina's doing up. But the numbers on the right-hand side, just not enough multifamily growth, and that one really worries me enough. 7.2% is not enough over the course of the last 10 years. A lot more on that particular front. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into it. When you go into that document, you're going to find all sorts of employment data. We have employment data broken down by supervisor district. We have employment data broken down on a city-by-city basis. Take a look at those numbers. Take a look what's going on. But when you're looking at those numbers and you're thinking about potential opportunities, I want you to continue to remember that everything you're seeing is happening in a labor force constrained environment. Everybody's struggling for that limited number of workers, and that is a critical issue that this region continues to face. So some thoughts on Monterey economic development. Look, the region has enormous upside. You have incredible natural resources, some of the best on the planet. You're located right next to this tech-heavy Bay Area economy, which yet again is doing better than the narrative would have you believe. And of course, there's a concentration of wealth. There's a concentration of people who care. Look at you in this room. You're here because you care about what's going on around you. And a lot of places, you don't see that kind of community leaning in and being engaged the way you are right now. This is amazing. And of course, you have the blessing of agriculture. This is the largest ag economy in the nation, but that is also a curse. It is a dominant form, and of course, because of the Dutch disease, it's preventing this area from getting out of its own way, from expanding the rest of its economy, and that is a labor force conversation. Housing supply, housing supply, housing supply. Now, thoughts on economic development. From an economic development standpoint, I want you to think about it in a couple different ways. First of all, understand what is economic development. Do you want to grow the overall size of the economy? Are there sectors of the economy? Are you trying to wage a quality of life for individuals who live here? What is your goal on that particular front? Well, from an economy-wide side, obviously labor force is the number one thing. Second thing from an economy-wide side is work with what you have. Ag is a huge part of the local economy. Ag tech should also be a large part of the economy. And I tell you what, when it comes to things like AI, I think AI is a bunch of hooey. It's right up there with cryptocurrency, okay? Except when it comes to complex manufacturing tasks or agricultural tasks. Look, I don't think AI is ever going to write a Nobel Prize winning research paper, but I do think that AI can learn how to pick strawberries. And as such, that can end up being an enormous lift for the local economy if you have the space to allow that kind of new tech. If you're thinking about adding tech to that thing, moving up the value chain in ag is a big part of the thing. Tourism is fantastic as well. It's a great opportunity for the local area to show off your local resources. But again, 1,000 rooms, where are you going to get those workers from? There, yet again, you have a Dutch disease-type problem. If tourism starts to take off, that'll make it hard to grow the other parts of your economy yet again. Housing, housing, housing because of that. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is individuals. How do we help individuals? And this goes back to something I said earlier. One of the characteristics of the ag-based economy is you have a lot of small business. There's a lot of small business. A lot of small business everywhere, but particularly here. And we've done some big studies on small business, and what we found is that the biggest issue with small businesses is, yeah, they have trouble scaling. In fact, what's interesting is how many small businesses, particularly minority-owned small businesses, that don't even have one employee. Because the complexities of engaging in a sort of a 1099, I'm sorry, not 1099, but a W-2 type employee is beyond the scope of a lot of these immigrant entrepreneurs, as the case may be. So, when I was hearing about the new business centers and taking that on, I was very excited about that. And by the way, I hope the next study we can do is a study on small business in the area. Where are they? What are they doing? And how do we lean in and help? Helping these small businesses truly scale up, going from that ground level, next level up, can be an enormous lift for your local economy and create value, even if you don't have enough labor force to deal with the more formal side of the economy. So that's a big part of things as well. And as for the overall economy, well, the big question on everybody is, are we out of the woods? And the answer is we were never in the woods. The economy's fine. Now, with all that being said, headwinds will intensify. As I mentioned, the economy is overheating a bit, and we have to pay attention to how long this can go until that's going to have to be something we need to deal with from a large basis. But this is 3-4 years in the future, nothing to be worried about right now. As for California, we're constantly trying to prove that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Simple as that. You think over and over again. I understand that, there's well-meaning intentions in Sacramento. We're worried about housing, yes, but it's not housing affordability, it's housing supply. We're worried about low-income earners, great, but the minimum wage is not the solution to that. It's training those workers to have a career path. That is how you need to do it. And last but not least, we just need more housing. And from that particular basis, stop trying to subsidize housing, rather just get out the way. Deregulation is the way to get the housing supply to increase to what we need. That is the path forward. But ultimately, the only way of fixing any of this stuff is, of course, to go fix the narrative. What is the real problem in our world today? The things we talk about are not what's happening. And we don't talk about what's actually happening. And that disconnect between our narrative and reality is keeping policy from truly doing good in our world, in the nation, in the state of California, and of course, right here in Monterey specifically. Whew! Our forecast is incredibly boring. No, I'm not going done. Last but not least, is sticky narratives. If you hadn't read this book, read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. He points this out in here. Why can't we get our narrative back to reality? Well, he does point out that narratives are sticky because too often what we do is we take our narratives and we make it part of who we are. And what we all need to do, me, you, everybody in this room, start this fix starts with us. It means understanding that our narratives, our chair's narratives, may not be exactly right. It's all been said before. Mark Twain famously said, it's easier to fool people than convince them they've been fooled. So go out, be humble, talk to people, look at the data, and recognize that if we can get the narrative on track, as great as Monterey is, you can make it even greater. Now you can applause. Thank you very much. We have a little time. There's your QR code to get all sorts of great information. Take a picture of that, and I'm going to take 2 questions for you, and then we'll go from there. You have a question? Go ahead. Fire away. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, the question was, do I think the supply can bring down housing costs faster than subsidizing? And the answer is absolutely, and I'll tell you why. Subsidizing housing is chasing your own tail. If you subsidize housing, the only thing you do is you increase the cost of housing. Right? I'm sorry, do you mean subsidize the renter or subsidize the building of it? Oh, well, if you subsidize the renter, the only thing that happens is that just causes higher rents because you increase housing demand without supply. That means rents goes up. So subsidizing renters is great for landlords, right? Do I think subsidizing the construction of new housing will help? Absolutely not. Because look, if you can build housing, you make money on it. It's a great. I was talking to a national home builder, and this is a conversation between one guy from Texas and the other guy from California. Guy from Texas, we built 5,000 homes nests last year, and we had a net revenue of $3 billion. The guy from California says, we built 1,000 and had a net revenue of $6 billion. The argument is, if you can build it, you'll make money on it. So subsidizing is not going to help. That's not the problem. It isn't the cost that restricts housing. It's the inability to build housing because of zoning, because of NIMBYism, because of planning boards, because of all these rules and regulations. This is what we need to fix, and that'll increase the housing stock. It's got to be about getting out of the way and letting private sector development into the mix. And by the way, I mean any kind of housing. Oh, you know, you can't build that. That's not affordable housing, right? That's what they hear all the time. You can't build that. That's not affordable. Years ago in San Francisco, there was a really fancy housing development that got shot down. It was a couple thousand high units on the waterfront. And the mayor proudly declared, "Ha! We shot that down because that was no good for anybody. That was 2,000 housing units for rich people, and we don't need that." Well, guess what? Those 2,000 rich people you just denied housing to are now going to gentrify one of your cherished working class neighborhoods. They will win. So when I say build housing, I mean build anything and everything, with, of course, one little exception. You want more multifamily. One last question, and we'll go from there. Yes, sir. Yeah. Oh, no, not at all. So that's about the warehouse in Salinas, right? And yes, the big warehouse, they're going to hire a bunch of workers. But remember, those workers are there to deliver stuff locally for the most part. An Amazon warehouse here is not going to be shipping stuff to all over the state. It's here largely for local consumption. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it more efficient for people to buy stuff online and get it to their house. Yeah, but you're right. They're going to have an extra problem in housing. And that's true for any kind of job growth here, right? Anytime someone wants to come and invest here, they're immediately going to run into that problem of where are you going to get those workers from? And that's true for those hotels. It's true for the Amazon warehouse. It's intriguing to me that they're optimistic enough that they can come here and do that. What that tells me is they think they're going to come here and simply outbid other companies. So you're right, it is a form of Dutch disease. That gets built and somebody else is going to lose employees because of it. Is it local retail? Is it local farms? Remains to be seen. But what we do know is the solution is not to prevent Amazon from moving here, but rather have enough multifamily in the county to make sure there's plenty of labor force for all these particular needs. Look, Monterey is one of the most insanely beautiful places, one of the most wonderful places on the planet. I mean that absolutely sincerely. I hope I can afford to live here someday, right? With all that being said, you're holding yourself back. And you're holding yourself back because of the unwillingness to invest in that critical asset, multifamily housing. Thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate your time today. Oh, my pleasure. Here.
Okay, I'll pretend to be Chris Thornburg now. Run the slides again, I'll make things up. I think I sounded fine without anything. All right, so we were going to do a fun little pop quiz, because I was a nerd in school, and after you learn, you're like, oh, let's do a pop quiz, right? But the technology to do this little Kahoot thing, it was going to cost $500. And I'm like, I'm not paying $500 for a dumb thing, you know? So I'm still going to give you the quiz, but it's just going to be for fun. And we're going to go old school. Kimberly, my lovely assistant here, has brought, so we're going to pass out. Do they already have their tickets? Yes. Oh my gosh, you guys are efficient.
Everyone have tickets?
Everyone, if you don't, you all have tickets? Okay. I want to make sure.
Raise your hand if you do not have tickets, please.
Wait.
Guys, are you
If
lying?
you do not. Wait a minute here. Uh-oh.
Oh, she's holding the
Oh,
whole table.
Sue Marcellus, you have your whole table. Okay. Could we get Dominion voting systems at this table, please? Sue Marcellus, in front of her friends. Okay. Here's my last notes before we do the quick pop quiz. Make sure that we have your email address if you would like to see the full report. The full report's like 178 pages, but it's a lot of pretty pages and whatnot. The summary is 20 pages. It's available for free. If you gave us your email address, we'll email it out to you. You can also go to mcbc.biz. Next week, we'll have it up there, okay? Let me see if mine. Okay, so who wants to win 4 hours with the Monterey touring vehicles? Anyone? Did you guys see the cars parked out in front of the building? There was a DeLorean there. I don't know. Did you drive that DeLorean here today?
Amazing.
All right. So you can rent that for like 4 hours. That's pretty cool. There you go. So you can get your lady friends dressed in pink. I was going to say the rules with this game are just you cannot be a friend or relative of Paul Farmer, and Ocean not included. All right, here's the questions. What county in California has the biggest ag economy in the whole nation? Well, this was the warmer-upper question, right? It's us. Sorry, Larry. How many more jobs did Monterey County's ag sector add than all other sectors combined from 2019 to 2024? A, B, C, or D? What do you think? Betty Saxon, what did you say? A is the correct answer. You guys are good. You want more tickets? Okay. What city has added the most residential building permits in the county? You guys were paying attention. It is Marina. How many more hotel rooms are expected to be available in Monterey County by 2030, according to C Monterey? Oh, this one I hear different answers. Eric, what's the answer? You don't know? I heard him say it during the presentation. The answer is D, 1,000. And the last question, what organization offers programs to scale small businesses in Monterey County? Is it the Sea Lions of Monterey Pier, the Moss Landing Otter Initiative, the Monterey County Business Council, or the California Condors Association? All right, well, I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. So we want to thank the county again, Richard Vaughn and the Economic Development Committee for supporting MCBC. Again, make sure that you have your emails with us if you want to see the full report. I mentioned Roger and the Small Business Development Center. We want to raise visibility for them. And not only if you know somebody who wants to grow their business, but also if business advisors, if you have a specialty in finance or marketing or something, you can talk with Roger about possibly being a business advisor. That's all I have to say. The QR code that's up there, okay, we'll get it up there, but that's actually to Chris's presentation, not to the full report. We'll get that up there, and then we'll send you the link to the whole thing. Okay, so thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoy an awesome Friday. If you go take your picture next to the DeLorean, you could tag MCBC on your social media. We won't complain. Thank you very much. Oh, I have to give them away. I'm like Sue Marcellus. Yes, Kimberly Craig. Kimberly Craig, the CEO of Monterey County Business Council. I'm going to pick him. Should I have Sue do it? Because I don't know if we can trust her. You know what? I trust her now. Don't look, though. I don't know if I should trust her.
Excellent. All right.
Here, you want to read the number?
Sure. Okay, our first winner is 357118. 357118. Come on up. That is.
We have to divide the. Okay. All right. I don't know about our process here. All right. The next ticket winner is 357054. 054. Anyone want to claim that? 054?
Must be present to win.
All right. If you don't claim it within 3 seconds, no. All right. So the next one is 357067. 067. Y'all have tickets, right?
Yeah.
Well, not a lot of people left, but.
I don't know.
All right. We've only given away one so far, yeah?
I am.
I tell you, all right. How about 357151? 151? You got it? All right.
There we go. Come on up.
Come bring it up here. I'll let Kimberly verify. I don't really trust myself that I'm the one, picking these, but. All right, 357206. 357206. All right, Ida. All right. Thanks. You guys have fun. When you rent your cars and take pictures, you can tag Monterey Touring Vehicles, tag us, tag everybody. Enjoy your Friday, and thank you for joining.